Today I want to refactor the necklace cutter, where the goal is to refactor some if-else code to chain of responsibility, and I will only do the smaller of the two methods from the cutter. I want to do the refactoring using only IDE tools and very simple, very safe changes like the microstep helpers from the provable refactorings list. I will link to that list in the video description below. Hi, my name is David, and for the past 20 years I've worked as an independent software developer and also as a consultant, as a coach and as a trainer for modern software engineering, or what we also call agile software engineering. If you're interested in that, then hit me up in the direct messages or at business@davidtanzer.net. In case you're not entirely sure anymore what the chain of responsibility pattern is exactly, then you're in good company, because I didn't remember too, but I did this cutter together with Peter Kofler yesterday, and he showed me again what it means, and then we did some refactoring, but we took some shortcuts, so I want to do it in a very slow way today, and I also want to record it. So when you want to use a chain of responsibility, you have some piece of code that wants to delegate the responsibilities, and it delegates them to a first object, which can either handle it, or if not, delegate it to a next object, which can again either handle it if some condition applies to this object, or if not, if it cannot handle it, it can delegate it to a next object, and so on. And then either the last object always does nothing in the handler, or the last object is null. Both is possible. Let's assume null here, which is probably the worst of the two versions, but it doesn't matter for this picture right now. So here's a part of the code of this cutter. There's actually much more code, but the only thing we're currently interested in is this if-else cascade here, and you don't even have to fully understand it. Just what's important is you can see here, I've added some tests together with Peter yesterday, and I'm using the same tests here, so we have full test coverage of this one method, and that's important for the refactoring. And as I've said, I only want to use IDE-refactoring, so basically what we can see in this menu, but depending on the code where we are, there might be different refactorings available. And I want to allow myself to use very simple code changes like adding an empty if, or adding an if where the condition is always true. And I said I want to allow the microstep helpers from the provable refactorings. So this would be this list here, where also adding an empty else to an if doesn't change anything, or also moving a line into all if-else-if branches also doesn't change the structure of the code. So we can do this manually and still be relatively sure that we didn't change anything. And with that, I want to start with the refactoring, but before I do that, please take a few seconds and think about how would you start a refactoring like that, and maybe tell me in the comments. All right, let's look at what we'll have to do to create the chain of responsibility for this. We have to move every if from this else-if cascade to a different object into different methods, and we have to chain them all together so that the functionality does not change. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I will just extract this into a method, and I'm already calling it handle. Now that was a simple change. Now I want to move this method to a different object, which will be the first part of our chain of responsibility, and for that I'll first create an empty class, which I'm going to do by hand, but it's a safe refactoring. And this is my first handler. When the tests are still green, I can commit again. Now I can move this method, the method handle, to my first handler. And the tests are still green. Now I can also convert this to an instance method in this class. And now we have a new first handler here. Instead of calling it statically, tests are still green. And now I want to create a template method pattern here, where the actual body of the method is in a protected method, and also the if condition is in another protected method, so that we can then pull it up into an abstract base class. So I'm going to extract another method here. And now I can surround this pack method with an if where the condition is always true, which will not change the functionality. Now I want to extract another method here for the condition, and I'm going to call this applies to, because we actually want to check the condition for the item. And this still cannot change anything, so the test should still be green. Now this pack method here should actually just run only this code, and the rest of the code should be handled by someone else in the chain of responsibility. And to do that, I want to move the other code first into a different method that I can then call in a different else branch. Let me quickly show you. So the first thing is I'm going to add some braces here to the else item. And then I can extract this into a different method. And now I want to call this code at first handle not diamond, and then we'll see what we do with it later. And now I'm going to do two things here, two provable refactorings that are basically just one move for me. I'm going to add an empty else here. That's the first one. And then I'm going to call an empty function here. And this would be handle next. I can create this method. It doesn't do anything. And by the way, I might cut some of my running the tests here, but I am really running the tests after each refactoring step. So if you later see a commit in the repository, then you can be sure that I ran the tests before committing. So I've moved the handle next method down here so we can see it side by side with pack. And I want to duplicate the code from here over to here, but that also means that we need the same parameters for handle next. So I want to pass in item and storage here first. And now I can copy the code from here over to handle next, which is, as you can see, just running the same code in the if and in the else path of this handle method. And since we still return true here, that doesn't change anything. Now I can use the correct condition in applies to. One could argue that I could have done this earlier, but it doesn't matter. And the tests are still green. And now I'm gonna run the tests with coverage. And you see here, this was basically what I expected, and also what I was hoping for is that here in the pack path, the handle non-diamonds is never called because it has the same if condition as applies to up here. And in handle next, the then path is never called because it can only ever enter the else path because it is in the else path of here. So now I can safely remove both ifs, but this is an operation that was not completely safe. So I'm going to now run the tests again. I'm always running them, but now I really need them. All right, now I want to move the handle next and the handle diamonds to a different handler in the chain of responsibility. And so I'm going to first add the next handler here. So I'm going to add a new second handler to the constructor here. I'm going to create the class second handler in our packing destination, and I'm going to add the constructor parameter and also create the field for this one. And now that I have the second handler, I now want to move this handle next method to the second handler, but I first want to inline this method, handle diamonds, and I want to inline all usages. It should not change anything here. And now I can move this one to the second handler. Now let's do some cleanup here. This will be 3 very small steps in one. The first one is I'm going to make the applies to and the pack methods non-static. And for some reason, I didn't see this in the refactoring menu here of convert to instance method. So I'm going to do it by hand. And then I can change the access modifier here to protect it, and here too. And this will help us to use this in a template method pattern, but only after we created the second handler in a similar fashion like that. So I'm going to move on to the second handler. In the second handler, I'm now doing basically the same thing as before, and I'm not going to add commits after every step here. So this will be one big commit in the Git repository, but let's do it step by step here. I'm going to add braces, run the tests, extract the method, heavy items, handle heavy items, run the tests, create an if true, move the code inside, run the tests. Now I can add an empty else block here and duplicate the code from the if into the else block, which still cannot change anything, but let's run the tests. Now, as you saw here, the method that does the actual work is called pack, and we also need an applies to method here. So let's call this pack, and I only want to apply it to the first one, and let's call this handle next. Oh, that's not possible here yet, so let's leave extracted here. And also I want to only use this. Tests are still green. Now I can call this method handle, and I can call this method handle next. Should have done it the other way around, but doesn't matter. Now I can extract here the applies to method and add the item as a parameter, which is still safe refactoring, cannot change anything, but let's call the tests anyway. And now we do the heavy lifting. I'm gonna add this condition here and then check the test coverage. And we have the same picture as before. Here in the handle next, the packing code is not covered, so it is never called, which is expected because we lifted the if condition. And here in the pack method, the other code is not covered because it can never be called. And now I'm almost done here. I can do the same here of changing the methods to protected and not static. And maybe change the order here too, so that we have the same order of methods as in the other object. Now both objects have almost the same shape, but I want them to have exactly the same shape, so because then the next step will be easier for me. So because of that, I'm going to extract here a handle next method too. This is where I'll commit, and then we're going to refactor to have an abstract base class in the template method. Now, should we call this just handler? No. Maybe this is a responsibility chain handler. And maybe an even better name would be a packing responsibility handler. Now I want to pull this method up into the superclass, where we have a refactoring here to do it. And this one needs the handle next, applies to, and pack functions, and I want to make all three of them abstract in the base class. And run the tests. And since they all are green, let's think about what we did here. We have a handle method, which is in the base class, and it calls currently three abstract methods, applies to, pack, and handle next. But I'm gonna try to eliminate handle next later when the whole chain is complete. Now the second handler has exactly the same shape as the first one, and because of that it should be possible to extend the same base class here. When we make this public, it should work. And now I want to use the override keyword here to make sure that all the methods where I think they should override a base class method actually do so. And that's nice. And since all the methods override a base class method, I should be able to get rid of this method because it has exactly the same shape as the method from the base class. This is not a safe refactoring, but I have my test for this case. Now I want to change the type of the second handler here to the base class. I'm going to do this with type migration. Then I can also name this next, and I can even name this next. And the tests are still green. And now we can call this first handler, since it only handles diamonds, we can call it diamond handler. And we have finally some name from the domain, which is nice. Now the second handler can get a third handler as a parameter. And I'm also going to create the field for the parameter. And then I can basically play the same game here. But let's do it one more time. And I'm doing it quickly this time, just to see that this refactoring now works for every other object in this chain of responsibility. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove the static here, which doesn't change anything. And then I can move this method to the third handler. That still doesn't change anything. Now I can refactor the third handler so that it uses the base class. And I want to do this slightly differently here. I'm just going to implement all the methods. I can say that this always applies, but also that both pack and handle next handle the heavy items. This still doesn't change anything because I'm still calling the handle heavy items method here from the second handler, but now we should be able to call handle here and it still should work. And now it's getting interesting again. I can extract another method here and just call this handle every other item. And I do not want to replace all of them. I'm gonna just move this out of the way to the bottom here, and already I'm gonna remove the static because it bothers me that all of those are static. Since the tests are still green, I can now inline this method here. Inline all usages and remove the method is the correct thing to do here. And this still should not change anything because it was an IDE refactoring. And now I can lift this condition up to the condition of the chain of responsibility again. And I don't need this variable here. This still works, and I'm now gonna run it with coverage again, and this should again prove that only one branch of the ifs is used in any of the two methods. And to leave the packing code in here, I actually need this pendant necklace. So let's first remove this code because it's easier. Run the tests. Now I can remove the else here because it was never used. Run the tests again. And I don't like this if here, which doesn't do anything except create this variable. So I'm gonna just reverse this to a simple cast. I'm gonna cast this expression here and remove the curly here, run the tests again, and now I can commit again because even the third handler is complete now. But I can also now call this second handler the non-heavy item handler, or the normal weight item handler. Now I'm gonna finish it and add the fourth handler and also rename the third handler and the fourth handler here. I'm gonna do this without talking, and then let's go back to this pack necklace method, add some variables and do some final code review here. Okay, I'm back here. I've created all the handlers, I've renamed them, I introduced variables, and now this method pack necklace looks like this now. It just sets up the chain of responsibilities and then handles it. Let's run with coverage again. And it's still fully covered and all the tests are running. One thing I don't like here is that we see the handlers here in reverse order. So other items handler is actually the last handler, but we use it as the first handler here, or we write it down as the first handler here because we need it in the next handler. We could change this with a builder pattern or whatever, also to make it more configurable, but that's not necessary right now. One thing I still want to do here is to get rid of this handle next function, at least in most cases. And to do that, I want first to pull this next handler up. So I'm gonna pull this up into the packing responsibility handler. And you can now see here that it did not always do the right thing here. Like we need a super call here, but we don't need this one. This was the pendant necklace. We already have this one. Here we need a super call, but not this. And the other items handler needs a constructor, but I actually want to call this with null here. Now everything still works. The refactoring was not completely automatic, but we now have the next item in the base class. So we can now also provide a default method for handle next, which would be just the next item to handle it. Since every single derived class here still overrides this, it won't be used yet, and so the tests are still green. And now we can try to just remove the handle next from every one of those, except from the last one, the other items handler. And of course I'm gonna always run the tests after removing it from one of the handlers. And the other items handler has an empty handle next. This saves me from using an if in the base class, but on the other hand, the other items handler here must know that there are no more handlers that come after it, so it might make this code less configurable. So if we ever need some other handler after here, then we need a constructor parameter here, remove this one, and maybe add the null check to the base class. But I leave it like that for now. And now we're getting to the big question: is this how you would have done it? Or what would you have done differently? Please tell me in the comments. I know that using the refactoring tools of the IDE like this can feel slow sometimes, but I think overall this was not slow. This was actually good progress, and I'm not sure if I personally would have been faster doing everything by hand and only running the tests afterwards. What do you think? Could you have done it quicker without the refactoring tools? Would it have been just as safe? Also, tell me that in the comments. My name is David. If you're interested in what I do, if you're interested in my teaching or my coaching, then contact me, and also we can just connect on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, on Mastodon, and on Blue Sky, and I will link all of those in the video description below. And until next time, happy coding!